Legend has it that the Emperor Napoleon once said of China, "There lies a sleeping giant, let it sleep, for when it wakes, it will shake the world." Apocryphal? Perhaps. But in recent decades, this long-slumbering Chinese colossus has begun to stir. Though not yet fully aroused, its immense size and weight have begun to command the attention of its neighbors, near and far. For some, this awakening giant is a symbol of rebirth and regeneration, inspiring hope and confidence. For others, it's an object of trepidation, its rising strength and growing self-confidence, a threat to the very foundations of Western civilization. What are we to make of this awakening Leviathan, this Gulliver among Lilliputians? How should we understand and deal with a rising China? Will it be a friend or a foe, partner or competitor? On the answers to these questions will hinge in no small measure the final epitaph of our present century, which many observers have already begun to call the Chinese century. This course will not provide definitive answers to these questions. Napoleon's grim warning of a restless, destructive China may prove prescient, or it may be grossly exaggerated. In either case, we cannot simply take his or anyone's word for it. We need to see for ourselves and then draw our own conclusions. Before we set out on this journey of discovery, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Richard Baum. I'm professor of political science at UCLA. For many years, I directed the Center for Chinese Studies at UCLA. My own introduction to modern China was almost entirely accidental. When I was a senior in college a long, long time ago, a scheduling conflict led me to enroll in a class with the rather daunting title, Government and Politics of China. Prior to that time, aside from seeing a few old Charlie Chan movies and enjoying the egg rolls and fortune cookies at Madame Wu's Cantonese Garden in Los Angeles, where I was born, I had no exposure whatever to anything Chinese. In my Chinese politics class, the first book we were assigned to read was Red Star Over China. It was a gripping tale of the early years of the Chinese Communist Revolution, written by a sympathetic American journalist named Edgar Snow. It included the very first authorized biography of the young Mao Zedong. And it featured a blow-by-blow account of the Chinese Communist Party's epic long march of the 1930s. I found it utterly captivating, a real-life adventure of daring do, with larger-than-life heroes and villains chasing each other across a war-torn Chinese landscape. It seemed clear to me then that Mao and his Red Army comrades had been welcomed as liberators by most ordinary Chinese. While outmaneuvering Chiang Kai-shek's larger, better-equipped nationalist army, the communists confiscated the property of the rapacious landlord class and distributed it to millions of poor and landless peasants. The peasants, in return, provided the bulwark of popular support for Mao's revolution. Of course, the true situation turned out to be rather more complicated than that. But it was still early days in my education, and I was still a bit naive. But I was definitely hooked on modern China. As it turned out, my fascination with the revolutionary adventures of Mao and his top lieutenants has never abated. After graduating from UCLA, I went on to get a doctoral degree in political science at UC Berkeley. My doctoral thesis dealt with the bitter factional struggles that broke out between Mao and his comrades in the early 1960s on the eve of the infamous Cultural Revolution. Since then, in an academic career that has spanned 4 decades, I have visited China more than 30 times. I've traveled extensively throughout the country. I've lectured in more than a dozen Chinese universities. Though Mao died before U.S.-China relations were finally normalized in 1979, and I never had an opportunity to meet the legendary chairman face-to-face, I have had brief personal encounters with 3 of Mao's latter-day successors, Hua Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping, and Jiang Zemin. And over the years, I've met with hundreds of high and middle-level officials and policymakers. These people play a significant role in the lectures and narratives to follow. For me, modern China has been a source of endless fascination, sometimes evoking feelings of profound admiration, while at other times leaving me feeling bitterly frustrated and outraged. But one thing that China has never, ever been is boring. Though I will try to maintain a general attitude of scholarly detachment and objectivity throughout these lectures, I will not shy away from revealing my own reactions to major Chinese events and developments. And I will share with you a number of personal observations and anecdotes from my various travels to China. To place the story of China's awakening in proper historical perspective, the first half of the course will trace the 19th century decline of Chinese imperial power, followed by the early 20th century disintegration of the empire, and the subsequent struggles among competing revolutionary ideologies and armies that marked modern Chinese history from 1912 until the advent of the People's Republic in 1949. The first half ends with an assessment of Mao Zedong's efforts to radically transform Chinese society after 1949, including both his early triumphs and, more spectacularly, his later tragedies, most notably the Great Leap Forward and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. In the second half of the course, we examine Deng Xiaoping's effort to reverse 2 decades of Maoist radicalism. In the late 1970s and 80s, Deng introduced a series of rather audacious economic reforms. These reforms set the stage for China's remarkable national revival. But there was a downside as well, insofar as unintended social stresses and strains produced by these early reforms led, at least indirectly, to the eruption and bloody suppression of massive student protests at Tiananmen Square in 1989. In the 1990s, under Deng's successor Jiang Zemin, China recovered from the traumas of Tiananmen and began to open its economy to massive infusions of foreign investment, trade, and technology. These latter reforms spurred the dramatic double-digit economic growth that has generally dazzled the world at large. Politically, however, China's post-Mao leaders proved highly reluctant to relinquish their traditional monopoly of power. And consequently, a substantial gap has emerged between China's dynamic, open economy and its rigid, authoritarian political system. In the latter part of this course, we will consider the implications of this bifurcation between politics and economics, and we will conclude with an assessment of China's rapidly changing role in international affairs. The full historical sweep of the course thus spans more than 200 years, from the initial decline in Chinese imperial power to the contemporary rebirth of a self-confident global Chinese powerhouse. The journey from there to here is a fascinating one, filled with a good deal of high drama and punctuated by a great many unexpected twists and turns. So please fasten your seatbelts, for we are about to embark upon a breathtaking ride. It is hard for the Western imagination to wrap itself around the idea that as recently as 200 years ago, the Emperor of China firmly believed that his worldly domain extended to the 4 corners of the earth. China was then, as it had been for well over 1,000 years, the Middle Kingdom, Zhongguo, the notional center of the universe. The emperor was the son of heaven, Tianzi. His earthly domain was coterminous with all under heaven, Tianxia. Grandiose? Yes, of course. But such imperial hubris was hardly unwarranted. From the founding of the Tang dynasty in the 7th century of the Common Era, CE, until the middle years of the Qing or Manchu dynasty in the 18th century, Chinese civilization and culture thrived, with only occasional disruptions, the most conspicuous being 2 foreign dynastic conquests, by the Mongols under Genghis Khan in the 13th century, and later by the Manchus in the mid-17th century. But not even the imposition of two foreign dynasties could substantially alter Chinese society and culture. So strong and deeply ingrained were the institutions and values of Chinese civilization that the conquerors were gradually absorbed and assimilated by the conquered. Dynasties came and went, but the Middle Kingdom lived on, its grandeur largely undiminished. By the time the Manchu dynasty fell in the early 20th century, the only visible remaining symbol of Manchu supremacy was the mandatory male queue or pigtail. In virtually every other respect, the Manchus had become thoroughly Sinified. In stark contrast to the longevity and majesty of the Chinese Empire, throughout most of this same 1100-year period, from roughly 600 to 1700 CE, Western civilization lay relatively dormant. From the onset of the Dark Ages following the collapse of the Roman Empire to the first blossomings of the European Enlightenment in the 16th and 17th centuries, the West slumbered while China flourished. A constellation of factors, institutional, technological, ecological, and cultural, helps to explain China's early rise as well as its extraordinary imperial longevity. Some of these factors, such as the philosophical traditions of Confucianism, were unique to China, while others, including mastery of the techniques of wet rice cultivation and irrigation, were shared with other ancient civilizations. But it was a unique combination of these characteristics that enabled the Middle Kingdom to survive and prosper, while other early empires rose, peaked, decayed, and disappeared, one after another. To endure for a millennium or even longer, a major civilization requires, first of all, a sustainable natural ecosystem. In China, two great east-west waterways, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, provided the water needed to nourish and sustain a large-scale agrarian economy. But China's continental monsoon climate, with periods of intense seasonal rainfall interspersed with prolonged dry spells, meant that farmlands in China were subject to frequent oscillating cycles of flood and drought. It was not for nothing that the Yellow River, birthplace of Chinese civilization, has for centuries been known as China's sorrow. Under these circumstances, only a sophisticated, well-coordinated system of hydraulic engineering could create the controlled flow of water necessary to support stable, densely populated agricultural communities. All successful ancient civilizations, including those in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and the Indus Valley, had this trait in common. That is, they all had relatively advanced water management systems that included large-scale, centrally administered networks of irrigation canals, dams, dikes, reservoirs, and sluiceways. China was no exception to this rule. But it was not sufficient merely to grow enough food to support a large population. To build and sustain an empire, ruling elites had to be able to siphon off substantial amounts of agricultural surplus from rural producers in the form of taxes, generally paid either in kind or in mandatory corvée labor, or both. These extracted resources were used in turn to support the ruler and his retinue of court officials, as well as to maintain a standing army, including periodic military campaigns, and to finance the construction of great urban centers and monumental structures, such as the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Incan temples at Machu Picchu, and the Great Wall of China. And let us not forget the tendency for empire builders in all great civilizations to indulge in the conspicuous consumption of luxury goods, including decorative bronze vessels, ornamental porcelains, gold jewelry, and the like. Such luxury items were produced by urban artisans whose livelihood depended in the first instance on the existence of long-distance trade networks, through whose commercialized arteries flowed the resources and the raw materials that were the building blocks of imperial splendor. But effective irrigation techniques, a taxable farm surplus, a vast network of trade routes, and even a specialized class of urban artisans were still not enough to create an enduring high civilization. A well-functioning empire also required substantial numbers of competent, honest, and loyal court officials, magistrates, and tax collectors. And this is where China's uniqueness first came into play. For beginning in the 7th century CE, Tang Dynasty officials introduced the world's first civil service system. Designed to recruit the best and brightest young men through a system of standardized merit-based exams, China's imperial civil service was, for its time, remarkably progressive, egalitarian, and democratic. Twice-yearly examinations were open to all males, regardless of birth or wealth. And to reduce the tendency toward nepotism and corruption that were engendered when local economic elites cultivated long-term personal relationships with local magistrates, an avoidance system prohibited civil servants from being posted to their home counties and also mandated the periodic geographical rotation of imperial assignments. Although the civil service system was nominally open and democratic, there were a few hidden catches. For one thing, only males could sit for the examinations. For another, one had to be thoroughly literate in order to pass the exam. And that, in turn, was no trivial matter, since Chinese was an ancient ideographic language that lacked a written phonetic alphabet. Indeed, a would-be exam taker would have to spend long years memorizing thousands of individual characters and tens of thousands of their combinations. As for the exam itself, it was a highly stylized exercise in the rote memorization and manipulation of certain classical philosophical texts, and had to be composed in a famously rigid and constrained style of writing known as the eight-legged essay. The eight-legged essay was constructed in the following manner. First came a 2-sentence opening statement, precisely 2 sentences, followed by a 5-sentence elaboration, precisely so, followed by a preliminary exposition and an initial argument, which had to be constructed in a discrete number of precisely paired sentences using precisely parallel language. Then came the central argument, followed by the latter argument, the final argument, and the conclusion. And all this had to be done within a prescribed number of words. And my UCLA students think they have it tough when I ask them to compose an expository essay. Because of the difficulty of mastering both the Confucian classics and the rigid format of the eight-legged essay, an aspiring imperial civil servant in China would have to be privately tutored for many years, even to have a shot at passing the exam, something that only well-to-do families could normally afford for their privileged sons. Peasant boys, by contrast, had to work in the fields. There was simply no leisure time for indulging in daily private tutorials. Thus, it is not surprising that the vast majority of successful examination candidates came from the affluent landlord gentry class. The subject matter of the civil service examinations consisted largely of ancient philosophical texts written in the 5th and 6th centuries BCE by the scholar sage Confucius and a small group of his loyal disciples. Known as the 4 books and the 5 classics of antiquity, these Confucian teachings were aimed at perfecting the moral self-cultivation of the idealized gentleman scholar. Rooted in traditional ethical principles such as benevolence, propriety, natural harmony, reverence for one's ancestors, and faithful observance of ceremonial rites and rituals, Confucianism prescribed a highly disciplined training regimen for would-be imperial officials. A successful examination candidate would of necessity be an accomplished Confucian scholar. In the Confucian scheme of things, good governance was rooted in the proper conduct of imperial officials, including the emperor himself. The moral code of Confucianism required conscientious observance of certain well-defined hierarchies of reciprocal status-based rights and responsibilities. Thus, for example, Confucian morality mandated that sons should be unconditionally loyal to their fathers, wives should obey their husbands, subjects should obey the emperor, and the living should revere the spirits of their deceased ancestors. It was all very precise and orderly, and everyone knew their place, at least in theory. Given this well-defined system of reciprocal obligations and responsibilities, a smooth-running Confucian society ultimately depended upon each member of an extended family and of the broader community that encompassed many such extended families or clans, knowing their proper place in relation to all other community members. There was no concept of universal social equality and no notion that individual freedom could take precedence over the obligation to enhance the collective welfare of the family. For such a family-centered, morally integrated community to function smoothly, its members had to share a common awareness of their mutual obligations and responsibilities. Now, this was all well and good within small, tight-knit village communities where people were generally connected to one another by kinship or by habitual neighborly interactions. But what of the non-Confucian others, the unassimilated aliens who inhabited imperial China's outer regions and border spaces? These outer tribes and nationalities included Mongolians, Tibetans, Muslims, Manchus, and more than 50 other ethnic groupings that did not share the moral traditions and principles of Confucianism. For these alien others, the emperor's moral authority and the ethical canons of Confucianism were insufficient guarantees of interpersonal harmony and social order. Something more was needed. That something was bureaucratic coercion. To ensure that people from different parts of the sprawling Chinese empire, that is, strangers unrelated by blood or ancestry, would act in conformity with Chinese norms and practices, punishment for aberrant behavior had to be swift and sure. Criminal conduct had to be well-defined and effectively deterred. It was the particular genius of China's early emperors and court officials that they recognized the need for both a morally integrated community of values governing ordinary interactions and a well-defined set of criminal laws and administrative sanctions to deter and punish aberrant behavior. Indeed, the unique longevity and durability of China's dynastic system owes much to the long-term coexistence of these two very different, but ultimately complementary governing traditions, known in Chinese as Li Zhi and Fa Zhi, respectively, Confucian moralism and coercive legalism, Li Zhi and Fa Zhi, which have sometimes been referred to as the yin and the yang of effective imperial rule. Of course, China's dynastic longevity and prosperity also benefited from the fact that for most of its 2,000-year imperial history, China was bounded by a collection of smaller, weaker states along its southern, western, and northern peripheries. Toward these lesser states, China's imperial court generally observed a policy of hegemonic tolerance, granting their local rulers substantial autonomy in exchange for ritualized military deference and political obeisance. This pax sinica was cemented by the regular gift of valuable national treasures or tribute from barbarian kings to the Chinese Son of Heaven. In addition to such ritualized tributary relations, routine commodity trade between China and its neighbors, near and far, waxed and waned periodically over the lifespan of the Chinese Empire. Early in the Common Era, a number of overland trade routes were opened, linking Western China with the people and cultures of Central Asia and beyond. Collectively known as the Silk Road, these trade routes reached their zenith during the Tang and Sung dynasties, from the 7th to the 12th centuries CE. It was via the Silk Road that Buddhism from India and Islam from Karakoram first found their way to China. And it was also via the Silk Road that the Venetian explorer Marco Polo first sampled the exotic silks, spices, and porcelains of imperial China. With the disintegration of the Mongol Empire in the last half of the 14th century, however, control over the Silk Road trade routes became fragmented among contending regional states. As disorder grew at the periphery of China's empire, commerce diminished, and the importance of the Silk Road as a major trade network sharply declined. This brings us to the question of imperial China's military power. Although Chinese armies were not normally used for territorial conquest, by the time of the Northern Sung dynasty, from 960 to 1127 CE, China's military superiority over its smaller, weaker neighbors was firmly established. An army of over 1 million soldiers was supplied by a state-controlled armaments industry that could produce in a single year up to 100,000 tons of pig iron, from which were forged tens of thousands of sets of body armor and as many as 3 million field weapons, mainly consisting of bows, crossbows, and lances. By clearly underlining the futility of armed resistance to the Son of Heaven, periodic displays of Chinese military might effectively underpinned the empire's tributary system of foreign relations. The story of China's remarkable imperial longevity, recounted all too briefly in this lecture, is an endlessly fascinating one. But equally fascinating is the improbable tale of spiraling imperial decline that beset China beginning in the late 1700s and culminated in the collapse of the last great Chinese dynasty, the Manchus or Qing, in 1911. In just a little over 125 years, China descended from unsurpassed power to unimaginable impotence, from being the mighty celestial empire to being the severely crippled sick man of Asia. In the next lecture, we shall explore the roots of this extraordinary imperial decline.